Some ships carry passengers. The Queen Mary carries souls.
James Johnson was one of many marine engineers assigned to look after the Queen Mary after it became a hotel. His job was routine maintenance. One night during his shift, something extraordinary happened that would chill him to the bone. He was checking the integrity of some recent repairs when he heard something odd and pressed his ear against the hull. Suddenly, strange noises seemed all around him that sounded like grinding or drilling. Then the sounds transformed into what sounded like hundreds of men screaming. An ear-splitting noise sent John reeling back, covering his ears in pain as he was stunned. And then he heard a marine engineer's worst nightmare, the sound of rushing water. He sprinted to the bow, expecting to see torn metal and drowning men. But when he arrived, the ship was unbroken. The night was calm, except for the screaming, which seemed to come from all directions. James stood frozen, listening to tragedy that could not be explained nor seen. Construction of the RMS Queen Mary was completed in 1936 at the John Brown and Company shipyard in Scotland. At 1,000 feet long, she was built to be bigger and more powerful than the Titanic. When the shipbuilders approached King George V about naming the vessel, he suggested naming it after his wife, Queen Mary of Teck. Initially a luxury transport, the Queen Mary was a marvel of engineering. 2 swimming pools, beauty salons, nurseries, a music studio, and telephones that could call anywhere in the world. She ferried Hollywood celebrities like Clark Gable and transported dignitaries like Sir Winston Churchill. But luxury would soon give way to something darker.
On a moonless night in 1959, Room B340 aboard the Queen Mary became the scene of an unthinkable tragedy. The Henderson family had boarded the ship 3 days earlier. Father James, a successful businessman, his wife Eleanor, and their 2 young daughters, Sarah and Mary, aged 8 and 6. From the moment they stepped aboard, James felt something was wrong. He kept seeing shadowy figures in the corners of their stateroom, hearing whispers that seemed to come from within the walls. At first, he said nothing, not wanting to frighten his family. But Eleanor noticed the change in him, how he would suddenly stop mid-conversation, cocking his head as if listening to distant voices. Fellow passengers would later recall seeing the family at dinner that evening. James seemed distracted, barely touching his food, his eyes fixed on something beyond their table that only he could see. Eleanor attempted to maintain a cheerful conversation with their daughters, though her worried glances at her husband didn't go unnoticed. The girls, dressed in matching blue dresses, giggled as they shared whispered secrets across the table, oblivious to their father's growing distress. That night James woke in a cold sweat, claiming he could hear the screams of drowning sailors. He paced the room, muttering about the men below and how they won't let us leave. Eleanor tried to calm him, but he insisted the ship was full of the dead. She watched in horror as he carried on conversations with invisible figures, arguing with them, pleading with them to leave his family alone. Around midnight, the night steward heard muffled sounds coming from B340. He hesitated at the door, listening to what sounded like James, speaking in different voices. But he convinced himself it was just the usual creaks and groans of the aging ship, a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. By morning, the truth revealed itself in horrible clarity. Eleanor was found in bed, still wearing her nightgown, dark bruises circling her throat. James had strangled her as she slept, convinced the spirits had commanded him to send them to safety. The girls lay beside her, positioned as if sleeping, their small hands clasped together even in death. In his twisted state, he had believed he was protecting them from the malevolent spirits he thought stalked the ship's corridors. James's body was discovered in the bathroom, a revolver still clutched in his lifeless hand, the walls bearing silent witness to his final violent act. His last words were scrawled in shaky handwriting on a piece of ship stationery. "The dead are calling. I must join them to protect my family."
Today, guests on B-Deck report seeing two little girls in blue dresses, holding hands as they skip down the hallway, their laughter echoing off the wooden panels. They appear and disappear near Room B340, forever playing an eternal game of hide and seek. Sometimes in the night, visitors hear soft whispers, two young voices sharing secrets that will never be told. More disturbing are the reports of a man's voice, desperately arguing with other unseen entities, followed by the sound of phantom footsteps pacing back and forth on the deck near Room B340. The ship's logs contain no explanation for James's actions, though some speculate that the Queen Mary's tragic history, the drownings, the wartime deaths, the accidents, somehow broke through to him, driving him to madness. Like many of the Queen Mary's mysteries, the true horrors of that night remain locked within the cold steel walls of Room B340, where three innocent souls were claimed by a father's descent into supernatural madness. Room B340 is reportedly the most haunted aboard the ship. Belongings being moved or thrown about, as well as disembodied voices telling them to get out, are some of what guests have recounted after staying there. After considering that there could be too much of a liability to leave it open, Room B340 was closed. It remained closed for years, until now. On Friday the 13th of April 2018, 30 years after the initial closing, Room B340 was reopened to the public, equipped with a Ouija board, tarot cards, and a crystal ball. The room is available for any daring guest who wishes to attempt contact with the other side. The tragedy of the Henderson family was just the start of the terrible history of the Queen Mary. When war erupted across Europe in 1939, the Queen Mary answered her country's desperate call. The luxury liner traded her elegant passengers for battle-weary troops. Her pristine white hull painted a somber gray that earned her the nickname Gray Ghost. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic depths like steel sharks, claiming nearly 3,000 Allied vessels during the war. But the Queen Mary possessed a saving grace. Her powerful engines could drive her through the waves at 32.5 knots, outrunning the enemy torpedoes that could only manage 25.
In the pre-dawn hours of October 2nd, 1942, a petty officer stood aboard the HMS Curacoa, taking a brief respite from the endless task of cleaning oil drums below deck. He absently wiped his hands on his uniform, leaving dark smears across the fabric, and stepped into the crisp Atlantic air for a cigarette. The silver lighter he pulled from his pocket was more than just a tool. It was a survivor, like him. He'd salvaged it from the ruins of his London home after the Luftwaffe's bombs had reduced everything else to rubble. Its scorched surface beneath his fingers served as a constant reminder of why he fought. The Curacoa carved its defensive zigzag pattern through the waves, a dance designed to confuse any U-boats lurking in the depths. At 4,000 tons, the C-class cruiser was no small vessel, bristling with anti-aircraft guns and torpedo tubes. Yet compared to their charge that night, the Curacoa might as well have been a child's toy boat. The petty officer stared into the impenetrable darkness, reflecting how the entire war felt like sailing blind across bottomless waters, waiting for death to surface without warning. The paranoia kept him awake most nights, along with the phantom explosions that left an eternal ringing in his ears. That ringing was suddenly drowned by the ship's alarm bell. The officer's heart stopped as he searched the waves for a periscope or torpedo trail. Instead, emerging from the fog like some ancient sea god was their escort, the Gray Ghost herself, and she was headed straight for them. For one terrible moment, the petty officer was transported back to his London shelter, listening to the approaching drone of German bombers. Then survival instinct took over. He leaped aside as the massive hull of the Queen Mary tore into the Curacoa, splitting the cruiser as easily as a knife through butter. The screech of rending metal filled his world as he plunged into the Atlantic's deadly embrace. When he broke the surface, gasping in the frozen air, he watched helplessly as the two halves of his ship slipped beneath the oil-stained waves. All around him, his shipmates, men he'd shared meals with, laughed with, fought alongside, thrashed in the frigid water, their bodies slowly surrendering to the killing cold. The petty officer treaded water, waiting for the Queen Mary to turn back, to save them. But the gray ghost maintained her course, disappearing into the fog as methodically as she had emerged. As his strength ebbed away, the petty officer's final breath carried a curse for the Queen Mary, leaving him and over 300 of his fellow sailors to the ocean's merciless depths.
The Queen Mary would go on to sail more than 600,000 miles, crossing the Atlantic at least 120 times in service to the Allied cause. They say Winston Churchill himself planned the D-Day invasion from her decks, and she carried countless troops to the blood-soaked shores of Normandy. When peace finally came, some say the gray ghost's hunger for souls lingered on, her halls now haunted by the echoes of those she left behind in the cold Atlantic waters. The Queen Mary has 49 recorded deaths. As many as 150 spirits are wandering her decks. The ship creaks and groans with the weight of its maritime history, but no section holds more darkness than the narrow passageway near door number 13. The watertight door stood sentinel in the aft section of the engine room, a silent witness to tragedy and terror. This watertight door was just another piece of maritime engineering, a crucial safety mechanism designed to prevent water from flooding different sections of the ship. But it's the cause for tales of death and some restless spirits. Some of the crew had a dangerous game they would play during drills, testing their reflexes against the door's 6-second closure. Each man would try to prove his bravery by darting through the 3-foot opening as it slowly closed. Most saw it as a moment of bravado, a chance to showcase their speed and nerve.
On the night of July 10th, 1966, John Pedder would lose more than just a game. At just 18 years old, he misjudged the door's speed. The massive metal barrier crushed him mercilessly, trapping him until the bridge was notified 7 minutes later. The Shaft Alley Spectre, a spirit in the area, is said to belong to John Pedder. His spirit lingers in the passageway, developing a peculiar and somewhat mischievous reputation. Females would report sometimes unexplained touches, a gentle stroke of hair, a caress on the cheek, a whisper light tickle in their ear. Some even claimed he'd brazenly pinch their backsides. Strangely, he seemed to ignore male crew members entirely, as if his spectral attention was reserved solely for women. Pedder isn't the only ghost haunting this section of the ship. 24 years earlier, a similar tragedy had unfolded. John Mackenzie met a far more sinister end. Unlike Pedder's accidental death, Mackenzie's demise was allegedly a deliberate act of murder. His fellow crewmates despised him and were said to have held him in place as the watertight door slowly crushed the life from his body. The ship's spectral residents aren't solely confined to the engine room. In the second-class pool, now the Royal Theatre, the spirit of a young girl of 5 or 6 years old named Jackie Torrin played out her eternal childhood tragedy. Jackie is said to have drowned in that pool. Her presence is marked by phantom splashes and childlike laughter that can suddenly pierce the ship's silence. Visitors often report hearing her sing "London Bridge is Falling Down," a haunting melody of a child forever searching for her lost parents, her spirit trapped between the water-stained tiles and memories of her final moments. Not far from Jackie's watery domain of the past, the corridors hold another ghostly resident. William Eric Stark, once a jovial second officer, met a horrific end after accidentally drinking cleaning fluid. His agonizing death has not been forgotten. His choking sounds can still echo through the ship's passageways, a grim reminder of his final terrible moments.
Now, visitors to the ship speak of more than just ghostly appearances. Rattling chain sounds where no chains exist. Mysterious knockings echo through empty corridors. Shadows dance on walls, moving independently of any living source. The ghosts of John Petter, John Mackenzie, Jackie Torrin, and William Stark, and so many others continue their eternal watch, their tragic stories forever etched into the metal and memory of the ship. Not all the tragedy on the Queen Mary is in the distant past. In 2011, a 26-year-old woman fell from the gangway after an argument with her boyfriend. She plummeted 75 feet into the chill water below and was pronounced dead at the scene. Was this just an unfortunate accident? We may never know for sure. Today, the hotel embraces its haunted history. Nighttime tours promise spirits that come out to play. Guests can dine alongside the supernatural, hearing tales of tragedy for just $50 a ticket. Is the Queen Mary cursed? Or is she simply a vessel of human tragedy, her steel walls holding memories too powerful to fade? The spirits are waiting. Are you brave enough to find out for yourself? Subscribe for more of history's most haunted locations.